Alright, so what I'm going to do is kind of pick up on a conversation that we had a few weeks ago about some adaptations and evolution and kind of give you some more framework for what the theory of evolution by natural selection is and kind of walk you through an introduction to some of the evidence that we'll be talking about in class. So let's break down this term first. When we talk about the theory of evolution by natural selection, there are lots of ideas that are already out there about this of what this concept is, and I want to make sure that you don't hold on to some misconceived ideas about what this concept is. So let's review some of this real quick. I'm going to talk about some of this. I want you to add to your notes. So the theory of evolution by natural selection, it is a scientific theory. So if you look back at your notes from last year and earlier this year, scientific theory is an explanation of information, of data, of observations. It's based on data and observation, so it's our explanation of that information. So evolution is that observation. It is that principle that we see, and natural selection is the theory that explains evolution. So let's talk a little bit about what evolution really is. So evolution is not necessarily one organism changing to another type of species. It is not a human giving birth to a monkey. It's not a monkey giving birth to a human. That is not what evolution is. Evolution is simply, sorry about that. It is simply, and that's an oversimplification what you think, well, if you thought that was true to begin with. But evolution is simply the cumulative changes, let's call these genetic changes in a population. Right? So it's not a population that changes, an individual that changes. Instead, it's a population that changes. So you wouldn't say that you or I evolve. We are evolved from previous populations. Again, it's not one species changing another. It's just about how one population changes over time. And you might think, well, evolution doesn't happen anymore. It does. Or that we can't see evolution happen. We can. And we'll talk about redefining what evolution is. Natural selection, again, is the theory that explains evolution. And so you might know a couple of names that are associated with natural selection. So you might have heard of Charles Darwin. You might have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace or A.R. Wallace. They actually came up with this idea together, so sometimes it's called the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution by natural selection. But Wallace has mostly been erased from the textbooks. There was somebody else who came up with the idea before Darwin and Wallace. It didn't get much traction. And then there's another name that, two other names that I think are really kind of interesting. Charles Darwin's grandfather, whose name was Erasmus Darwin, actually started coming up with the idea of evolution. Did not come up with the theory, but the idea of evolution. Was able to see that through fossil records and other data sources. And then we've got one more name who came before Darwin, and his name is Lamarck. And he has an alternate idea that has been largely disproven, but there's some ideas that are coming back. His idea is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Oops, sorry about that. Characteristics. Okay, so, but I'm going to put in a little X next to it because we know that this idea is largely wrong. We go largely with the natural selection idea, but there's accruing evidence of acquired characteristics being happening in some situations. So, theory of evolution by natural selection is what we're really going to talk about. Alright, so in your notes you should have, let me just erase what I wrote here. So what we're going to do is redraw the diagram that you should have in your notes. So I want you to flip through your notes. You should have a flow chart, or you can just recopy it here. I recommend recopying it. Where we have variation and overproduction, we've got competition, survival, and then reproduction. And this is really kind of a flowchart that helps explain the idea of natural selection. We'll talk about the evidence in just a minute. So, so any population will reproduce, right? That's a characteristic of life. Do you remember dog racer? I'm going to add a little note up here that when we're talking about dog racer, what we're talking about are several different things here. So we're going to talk about genetics and DNA. We're going to talk about reproduction. We'll talk about, even energy and nutrients we'll talk a little bit about. Even different types of cells. If you go back to your notes on the endosymbiotic theory and the evolution of eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic cells, we're talking about cells. Definitely A for adaptations. Respond to environment is actually a product of evolution. And growth and development is a little different because this is about individuals. And remember, we're talking about populations here. So it's not really growth and development, but the capacity to grow and develop is something that you've inherited. And same with the organization. So we're going to be kind of talking about these ideas. So you might want to review what dog racer stands for in your characteristics of life. No, I'm not going to say you might. You should. You need to. All right, so we've got these ideas, and we're going to kind of add a little bit of context to it. And so what I've done is added a few notes, just a few, to this. I'm going to walk through this to make sure you understand this, and then we're going to extend this to a couple of examples. All right. So what I've annotated around variation is genetic variation. You and I have different preferences for things, which are maybe genetic, probably not, but we do have some genetic variation. We are not genetically identical. You and your sibling are likely not genetically identical, unless you're identical twins. And that variation is a good thing. The cause of that variation, that genetic variation, is meiosis and random fertilization. Those are the two things that led to the difference between you and a sibling, or you and your cousins, or your parents' siblings, differences between your parent and their siblings. It's all about meiosis and random fertilization. So meiosis, if you haven't learned anything about that yet in previous science classes, like in middle school, meiosis is this process of taking genetic information from a parent and taking half of that genetic material and making that available to pass on to the next generation. So an adult would be making sperm or egg that have half the number of chromosomes that they would possess in their normal body cells. So humans have 46 chromosomes, but the sperm of a human male would have 23 chromosomes, and the chromosomes in an egg from a human female would also have 23 chromosomes. It's not always the same 23 chromosomes. It's different mixes, with some constraints in there, but different mixes of those chromosomes, which lead to different sperm and egg that carry different chromosomes. And once you have those, you have millions of sperm that are available to fertilize an egg, and really there were millions of eggs, but only one released a month. There's an idea of random fertilization. We can't control which one is going to fertilize, which sperm is going to fertilize which egg. So there's some, as far as we understand, some randomness to that. There's also the idea of mutation. So only those things that sexually reproduce will go through meiosis and random fertilization. But all organisms, whether they sexually reproduce or asexually reproduce, will have an element of, or a factor of mutation that leads to variation. But reproduction also produces many, many, many offspring, well beyond the carrying capacity of that environment. They make more offspring than can survive. And that overproduction is critical for survival because there has to be competition. Now, we'll talk about why there has to be competition, but competition, as much as sometimes we like it or some of us don't like it, it is necessary for our survival. So when we compete because there are limited resources, or limited mates, or we want to avoid being eaten, that's predation avoidance, some of us are better at that than others. And when we talk about the genetic reasons that some of us are better than others, those reasons are what we call adaptations. And we want to be really careful about this. We don't want to be eugenic. That's not what this is all about. And we're talking about all living things, not humans. But those genetic variations that help in a particular environment are called adaptations. And these are things that we don't necessarily see. So when you learn about genetics in middle school, all of those genetics problems, I think most of them were about physical things that you can see about somebody. But every single protein in your body is a product of your DNA code. So every protein in your cell membranes is a product of your genetic code that you inherited, right? You inherited from your parents. And we don't see those from the outside. So it's much more than what we think we have conscious choice over. So these adaptations help some of us survive, and sometimes that survival is called survival of the fittest. But I do not like that language. I don't want you to use it. So I've only indicated it here because sometimes that's what you associate with it. But survival of the fittest is misleading if you don't know what fittest means. So fittest is not the strongest. It just means having the most offspring survive to pass down that genetic material to future generations. So if you only go one generation, if I have a lot of kids, you still don't quite have enough information to know if I'm genetically or evolutionarily fit or not, because you don't know how much genetic material gets passed on to the next generation or future generations. So it's this long-term idea, but because of that idea of fitness, we have this other idea that there are differential rates of reproduction. So it's not about if you've made it through this competition, you've survived, you're all set, or your ancestors are all set, or the ancestors of the bacteria were all set. Those things also have to reproduce more than other individuals in that population. And if they reproduce more, they're passing down more genetic information into future generations, which then change that collective cumulative genetic code in that population, and that is evolution. Sorry about the noise in the background. So that's the idea of how natural selection leads to changes in a population. This idea of competition is critically important because these things that organisms are competing over are variables. They're always changing. And so if we did not have overproduction and variation and the environment changed, it would lead to extinction. And that's what happens often with a lot of the crops that we grow. Farmers do not like the idea of variation. They depend on the idea of variation, which has led to really sweet apples or bananas or whatever other fruit or even animal that they're trying to grow. They want to minimize the variation once they find a product they really like. And so they don't allow things to go through sexual reproduction anymore. They just clone them because they don't want varieties that they don't want, right, that are no longer good or deemed good by us. And so we end up with these things called monocultures. So most of the potatoes we grow in the United States is dictated by the fast food industry. We grow lots and lots of russet potatoes, but and they're mostly clones. And so if there was something that came through that knocked them all out genetically, then we wouldn't have as many potatoes. That's what's going on with bananas right now. So all the bananas that we eat, the most of the bananas we get at the grocery store are plagued by a fungus, I think, in Southeast Asia, and scientists are now talking about when that fungus spreads across the world, not if it spreads across the world, but when it does, those bananas are going to be wiped out. So variation is critically important for the survival of a population. It may be good for you or me, but it may not be good for us as individuals, but as a group, it certainly is beneficial to our population so we don't go extinct. But sometimes the environment changes so drastically that the genetic variation that is in the population still isn't good enough, and that inevitably leads to extinction. All right, so I want to give you another visual here. So what I've given is an initial population that's represented by these purple dots and yellow dots, and there's some kind of filtering event. So some kind of competition. Maybe it's, if this is bacteria, I'm just give you a different example than humans. If these are bacteria, then there's a variation that we'll call purple and a variation that we'll indicate with yellow. And if some kind of chemical is introduced into the environment that the variation that's yellow is subject to, is vulnerable to, then perhaps they don't survive as much, right? So in the next generation, so this is generation 1, here's generation 2, we're going to see fewer of the yellow variety and more of the purple variety. And when they all reproduce, we're going to see more and more purple and fewer yellow. Maybe no yellow, but maybe some yellow. And that's what this differential rates of reproduction means, that we have fewer yellow. So if we were to look at the collective gene pool, or all the genetics that are available in this population, from this original generation to this final generation, we will see changes. And that itself is the definition of evolution. It's not this bacteria change into a new type of bacteria, a new species of bacteria. It's that there were genetic changes in the population. And that is simply the idea of evolution. Okay,